Blood dripped from the marble altar as silence fell across Rome. The torches flickered against the temple walls, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl closer with each gust of wind. It was the year 37 AD, and a new emperor had ascended. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, remembered by history with one infamous name, Caligula. The most terrifying sexual practices of Caligula, the insane, were not the tales of rumor whispered in wine's taverns. They were realities carved into the lives of senators, soldiers, and slaves alike, twisting Rome's heart into something grotesque. Caligula did not rise in obscurity. He was born into the ruling Julio-Claudian dynasty, grandson of Mark Antony, great-grandson of Augustus, and son of Germanicus, the beloved general whose victories had made the Roman legions worship his name. From childhood, Caligula had been steeped in power, dragged along with the army, where soldiers nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boots, for the miniature soldier's uniform he wore. That boy, adored by the legions, would one day wield Rome's sword, not against foreign enemies, but against his own people.
The transition from hope to horror was swift. When Caligula first took the throne, crowds wept with joy. Senators praised his generosity. Festivals erupted in the streets. After the brutality of Tiberius's rule, Rome believed a savior had come. But within months, the mask slipped. Behind the smiles lurked obsessions with sex, humiliation, and the destruction of every boundary. Rome had crowned not a healer, but a predator. What makes a man's hunger turn into Rome's nightmare? Ancient chroniclers Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe a reign where politics and perversity fused until no family was safe. He's said to have slept with his own sisters, dragging them into his bed as if their lineage was simply another jewel to collect. Did you know that Caligula even paraded his sister Drusilla through banquets, not as kin, but as a consort, forcing senators to watch in silence? It was not lust alone. It was the theater of domination. Imagine the Senate chamber cloaked in the dignity of centuries. Senators file in, cloaks heavy, hearts heavier. Caligula, perched on his throne, announces his decree. Wives may be seized at his pleasure. A senator watches as his wife is summoned, trembling into the emperor's private chambers. Hours later, she emerges pale and silent, her eyes fixed on the marble floor while her husband must bow as though nothing has happened. Power was no longer about laws or armies. It was about control of the most intimate bonds. The empire itself became his stage. During public banquets, he's said to have chosen noble women at random, dragging them behind curtains, then returning with mocking commentary on their performance. These women, stripped of dignity, carried their shame into homes where their families could not speak of it. To resist was to invite death. To endure was to lose one's name. Caligula understood something chilling.
That to own the body was to own the soul. Rome's traditions of marriage, sacred vows, and family honor became playthings. In one notorious act, Caligula forced the marriage of his loyal officer, Micro's wife, Ennia, only to claim her for himself. He mocked the sanctity of the ceremony by turning it into a grotesque performance where Rome's ideals were defiled in plain sight. To Caligula, sacred bonds were not to be respected, they were to be broken for sport. Did you know that Caligula's own palace was rumored to be transformed into a brothel? Ancient accounts describe corridors where noble women were forced to serve strangers, with the emperor profiting from the humiliation. This was not mere decadence, it was a deliberate inversion of Roman morality. The palace of the Caesars, once a symbol of divine authority, became a market of shame. The currency was not gold, but dignity. But the horrors reached further than Rome's elite. Slaves and servants, already powerless, bore the brunt of his appetites.
Imagine the kitchens where a young servant girl is summoned in the night. She steps into chambers thick with incense, the emperor waiting, his eyes burning with cruelty. She knows resistance means torture. She knows compliance means silence forever. Neither choice saves her humanity. Caligula's perversions were not hidden in secrecy, they were paraded. Public humiliation became policy. At gladiatorial games, he sometimes ordered the wives of noblemen to sit beside him,
then whispered orders that reduced them to pawns of his desire. Rome's crowd roared for blood in the arena, but in the emperor's box, lives were being shredded in quieter, more devastating ways. Why did Rome endure it? Fear. Terror silenced every tongue. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, obeyed his whims. Senators, stripped of power, bowed deeper with each insult. The people who had once cheered him as savior now whispered only in shadows. Rome had created an emperor with godlike power, and in Caligula, godhood had turned monstrous. Consider the emotional wreckage. A mother watches as her daughter is taken into the palace, never to speak again of what happened inside. A husband swallows his rage as he bows before the man who violated his wife. A sister, stripped of identity, is paraded as both kin and lover. These were not isolated incidents. They were the architecture of Caligula's reign. Did you know that Caligula declared himself a living god, demanding worship even as his crimes mounted? Temples rang with prayers forced from trembling lips, while behind closed doors, those same worshippers endured his most intimate torments. Religion itself became another tool of humiliation. To refuse worship was treason. To participate was to feed the delusion. Rome's marble walls could not contain the stench of fear. Soldiers, senators, nobles, and slaves alike lived under one truth. No boundary existed that Caligula would not cross. The laws of family, the sanctity of marriage, the privacy of the body, all crumbled under his gaze. And yet behind the terror, questions lingered. How could a man raised in the heart of the Rome, son of its most beloved general, descend into such madness? Was it sickness of the mind? Was it the corruption of absolute power? Or was Rome itself to blame for giving divine authority to a mortal who saw divinity only in cruelty? The banquet tables remained heavy with food, the arenas roared with spectacles, and the palaces glistened with marble. But beneath the grandeur, Rome had become a cage. Every laugh at Caligula's jokes was forced, every cheer was hollow. The empire's veins carried not pride, but dread. This was the beginning of a reign where power became indistinguishable from perversion, and where the emperor's bedroom was more feared than the battlefield. Rome had survived wars, plagues, and conspiracies, but could it survive an emperor whose desires consumed the very fabric of society? The answer would come, but first Rome had to endure, and the empire would learn in the most intimate and devastating ways that sometimes the deadliest weapon is not the sword, but desire unleashed without restraint. The night skies over Rome often glittered with torchlight, but under Caligula's reign, those flames illuminated horrors the city had never before endured. His palace, once the beating heart of imperial authority, became a labyrinth of fear, lust, and degradation. The most terrifying sexual practices of Caligula and the insane were not whispers confined to private chambers. They unfolded in public halls, religious festivals, even within the Senate itself. Power and intimacy fused into one grotesque performance, and every Roman senator, soldier, slave risked becoming part of the emperor's theater. Caligula's tyranny turned the sacred into the obscene. He was said to desecrate the Vestal virgins, women sworn to 30 years of chastity, guardians of Rome's eternal flame. Dragged from their temple, they became unwilling participants in his games.
Did you know that breaking a vestal's vow was considered the ultimate sacrilege, punishable by burial alive? Yet under Caligula, their purity was not broken by secret lovers, but by the emperor himself, who turned their sacred bodies into trophies of humiliation. The Senate chamber itself, the marble floors, the gilded benches, the statues of Rome's forefathers became complicit in his depravity. Senators arrived expecting decrees about taxation or war, only to be forced to watch as their wives or daughters were summoned, displayed, and disgraced. Imagine the hollow silence, senators staring straight ahead, faces like stone, as their family's dignity was shredded before their eyes. To protest was to die, to endure was to live without honor. And yet the humiliation grew even darker when Caligula extended his power to the very bonds of blood. Accounts describe his obsession with his sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina, and Julia Livilla. He flaunted them at banquets, hinting openly at incestuous unions. Drusilla, the favorite, was treated as an empress, seated beside him as though she were wife rather than sister. When she died suddenly, he mourned her as though she were his spouse, deifying her in temples. For Rome, the line between kinship and corruption was erased before their eyes. Caligula's cruelty was not merely indulgence, it was calculated humiliation. He knew the value of spectacle. In one chilling custom, he paraded noble women at feasts, forcing them to leave their husband's side and join him in private chambers. When they returned, he mocked them publicly,
describing intimate details to the laughter of guests. Imagine the burning shame of a matron, her private self dissected as entertainment, her husband forced to laugh or risk death. Rome's nobility became actors in the emperor's grotesque play. Stripped of dignity, their lives rewritten in humiliation. Did you know Caligula was rumored to transform sections of his palace into a brothel, staffed not with courtesans, but with the wives of senators and knights? Patrons were invited or ordered to pay for access, the proceeds flowing into the emperor's coffers. What had once been Rome's center of governance became a market of degradation. Coins clinked on marble counters, but the true cost was measured in shattered families and violated sanctity. The empire's religion, too, became twisted into a tool of sexual tyranny. Declaring himself a living god, Caligula demanded offerings not only of incense and coin, but of flesh. He styled himself as Jupiter incarnate, even parading in the armor of gods, and forced Rome to bow to his fantasies. Imagine the terror of priests compelled to stage rituals that were half worship, half orgy, knowing that refusal meant execution. The line between religion and perversion blurred until both were indistinguishable in the emperor's gaze.
Slaves, often invisible in Rome's grandeur, suffered perhaps the most. Young girls and boys, bought or seized, were trained not in service, but in submission. Their cries were muffled by palace walls, but the echo of their trauma haunted every corner of Rome. In the kitchens, a cook might whisper to another of the screams heard at night. In the corridors, guards turned their eyes away, knowing silence was survival. Every layer of Roman society, from the highest senator to the lowest slave, bore the weight of Caligula's appetites.
But Caligula's sexual practices were not confined to Rome alone. When he traveled, his lust traveled with him. On religious processions, he stopped ceremonies mid-ritual to claim whomever caught his eye. In the provinces, local elites trembled at his arrival, knowing their daughters and wives could be summoned without warning. Rome's empire stretched across continents, but no distance shielded its people from the reach of one man's desires. And what of the people?
the ordinary Romans who filled the streets, markets, and amphitheaters. They whispered of his madness, of his unquenchable lust, but whispers were dangerous. Informants lurked everywhere. A single careless remark could lead to torture, exile, or death. So fear turned into complicity. Crowds cheered at his appearances, even as they knew the man they hailed was destroying the very soul of their city. Did you know that Caligula once ordered the marriage of a bride and groom to be interrupted on their wedding night, claiming the bride for himself? The act was not passion, but spectacle, the theft of innocence, the breaking of vows, the destruction of trust, all for the pleasure of seeing devotion crumble under his will. For Rome, marriage itself ceased to be sacred. By the end of his reign, Caligula's sexual tyranny had corroded the empire's foundations. The Senate had lost all dignity.
Families lived in fear of summons to the palace. Religion was mocked. Marriage was defiled. Even the word Rome, once a symbol of discipline and strength, had become synonymous with shame under foreign eyes. Allies whispered of the emperor's madness. Enemies laughed at the empire that bowed to one man's perversions. But power born of terror always breeds rebellion. Within the Praetorian Guard, loyalty cracked. Soldiers who once obeyed every order now muttered behind closed doors. Senators who had endured humiliation nursed secret rage. Rome had been paralyzed by fear. But fear can only silence men for so long before it hardens into resolve. And so, in January of 41 AD, the torchlight of Rome flickered again. Caligula strode through the palace,
Drunk on his guardhood, unaware that daggers waited in the shadows. The same guards who once enforced his lust now turned against him, stabbing him in corridors that had witnessed his darkest crimes. Blood pooled across marble, and with it ended the reign of the man who had made Rome a brothel of humiliation. Yet his death did not erase the scars. Wives stripped of dignity, husbands broken in silence, sisters turned into lovers, slaves mutilated in body and soul. Rome could move forward politically, but emotionally, the empire carried the ghosts of his reign. History would forever remember the grandeur of Rome, but beneath its triumphs lay stories of degradation so profound they could not be buried. The legacy of Caligula warns us of the dangers of unchecked power, of what happens when desire becomes law, and when no boundary exists between ruler and ruled. Rome gave one man the body of an empire, and he devoured it. And so history whispers its warning. The greatest empires do not always fall to foreign swords. Sometimes they rot from within, consumed by the appetites of those crowned as gods.